In this video, I'm going to share some of the easiest tricks or techniques that you can use in Lightroom to make the biggest difference to your photos. When you have seen this video, and if you want to learn even more, I have my spring sale running right now where you can get $100 off my big Photoshop for landscape photographers post-processing course. So I am working in Camera Raw, which is the same as Lightroom. Lightroom just have the catalog functions too, but the editing algorithms are exactly the same. And you can also see I have all the different tools you also have in Lightroom. So the first thing I want to show you is how to make a flare. So let's just go up to our masking tool right here. You can either left click on it and select whatever you want, or hold down the left key, hover over it without letting go, and then just choose radial gradient right here. And when we're making a flare, we're simply just trying to emulate a lens flare. So what we want to do is we want to bring the contrast down, maybe bring the blacks up, and we want to dehaze it a little bit, maybe use the clarity slider negatively. And then let's bring up the temperature. It's very, very important that when you make flares like this, that you respect the light and make sure that the flare comes from the direction where the light is coming from. It makes no sense that the light comes from here, but your shadows are pointing in that direction. And then we can bring up the exposure a bit, or the whites also. Let's go in and make some global adjustments. Just bring this up, bring in the contrast, and you can see how that glow, that flare is really starting to pop right there. We can just keep controlling it to our liking. We can turn it a little bit and we can bring it up and down. If we bring up the whites, we can almost blow out the highlights right there. So this is how I make almost all my flares in Camera Raw. So for the next tip, I'm going to show you how I deal with blown out highlights. Generally, I want to always make sure that I capture all the information in the field that I can, also in my highlights, even though I'm shooting into the sun. But in this case here, you can see I did take some brackets, but sadly, I actually do not have all the highlights available over here. And if we click Auto, what you definitely want to avoid is to have a part of your photo that looks like this, where the highlights are just completely blown and it's just a white blech. So to combat that, we simply just go out and make another radial gradient, put that on top, and then we simply just make it glow. It's all about making sure that the edges around here are not too hard. And the only way we can do that is simply just make them invisible by bringing up some highlights and playing with the sliders right here. So we actually put a flare on top of it because we want to hide it. It looks unrealistic and it looks a little bit amateurish if you have those very hard edges from some bright clouds into a blown out highlight. And I can see that in this case here, one flare isn't enough, so we have to try one more and just bring down the clarity again, maybe dehaze it even more, and then we can just put another one on top and bring up that exposure a little bit more. But that is what happens if you don't capture all the information when you're on location. So make sure to bracket your photos properly. There is also a whole lot of small, very, very, very important things that you need to do with almost all your photos. And the first thing is, if you do have a horizon line that's supposed to be straight, you simply just go into your cropping tool, choose the straightening tool, and then you just hold down the left mouse button and pull out along the horizon. In that way, we have now straightened the horizon. Secondly, you need to clean your photos from dust spots. There are a few different ways to do this. The easiest way when you're working with the sky is to go into your cleaning tool and go to visualize spots. And here all the dust spots are all these small circles here that you can just go through your photo and clean up. Now, in some circumstances, the visualize spots tool is not the optimal one to use. And then you can go back into your global adjustments and go down and say dehaze. From there, you can also see the different dust spots. I even have a big one here that the visualize spots did not see. And from there, you simply just go in and again start cleaning. Once you're done with that, remember to go back in and get your dehaze slider down. Another thing you also always want to do is to go down to your optics and choose remove chromatic aberration. Good. The next tip is to make sure that if you're shooting in high contrast areas and you're shooting with less than optimal optics or lenses, then you want to remove fringing from those high contrast areas. So in this example here from this forest, simply just go in here and you see, oh, there are so much purple fringing going on here in the corner. It doesn't look good. Even if we choose remove chromatic aberration, it doesn't really help. So what we do is we go into manual and then we go down to the defringe tool right here. And then we can sample the fringing and boop, there we go. All our purple fringing is now gone from the photo and not distracts anymore. Another thing I also do to almost all my photos that makes a massive difference is to make sure to denoise it properly. So I simply just go in here and choose denoise. This is the enhance function, the AI denoise function. And you can see here in the preview how it just removes the noise, but actually makes sure that the details of the tree trunk here actually stays. You can pull this slider back and forward, but generally I prefer to just keep it in the middle and then you can click enhance. Now this photo here is relatively easy to denoise because I've shot it at ISO 50. The reason why I've already edited this photo so much is to show you that there's also a substantial amount of noise both at ISO 100 and ISO 50 if you, like me, edit your photos a lot. But if we take one of my night photos, aurora photos that are photographed at ISO 4000 and go in and denoise that one, you will see that the noise reduction in the bright areas is actually really good. But in some of the darker areas, it's not that strong. So if we just go up to auto and we zoom in, we can see that the grass here in the foreground looks very weird. Plasticky. If I take the original photo, you can see it's full of noise and it's out of focus grass, but the denoising, it haven't really done that good of a job. In a case like this is where I would stack photos in Photoshop to reduce noise. I have a video where you can see how I do that up here in the corner. But what you will see is that the night sky is just almost completely clean. And that is quite fantastic. The next tip here is also one I use all the time, and it's simply just selecting the sky and manually working on that. So we go into the masking tool and just select the sky. And from here, I can bring down the exposure, I can bring up the contrast, I can add some saturation if I want to do that, and so on and so forth. But here comes the main trick. If we go into the three dots and we say duplicate and invert, then we have a mask for everything that is not the sky. So here I can do exactly the same. And in that way, I can work on both the foreground and the sky individually. Be careful what you do and what sliders that you pull back and forward, because you still want to make sure that you respect the light and make sure that it looks somewhat realistic. So if you followed my channel for a while, you know that I really love my forest photography and I love to photograph foggy forests. This next trick here utterly blew my mind when I figured it out. So here I have a forest scene and it is foggy. I did have some fog this day, but I want to bring in more fog. So I make my radial gradient filter and I simply just make it big and good right there. And then I go down and put in some negative dehaze. So I bring in some fog and I bring that clarity down and maybe I reduce the contrast too. So now I have basically made a little bit more fog, simulated some fog. It is important for me to say that generally when you want to create fog like this in a forest, it's good to have some fog already, else it doesn't look realistic. But here comes the trick. So the problem is that I'm applying all this fog to both the background and the foreground, and it doesn't really look that realistic. So what I want to do is to go in and just make sure that the foreground tree is not being affected by this mask. So I go in here, say subtract, and then I choose select objects. And from here I just go in and select these very defined branches. subtract again, select object, like this here, subtract object again, the tree right there, and you can just continue like this until it figures out what part of the tree should be selected. And we can do the same over here with this entire part here. It didn't really figure it out up there. And subtract again, objects with the tree right there, and one more time for this one. And from here you can of course go in and refine it with the brush. So we simply just take this one here, bring the flow up, and just brush out the last parts you couldn't select with the object. So bring it in there. So now when I turn my mask on and off, you can see how I have added a little bit more fog, a lot more fog to the background. And this object selection tool is just so good. In this example here from Iceland, if we go into my masks, you can see I've actually used that to select the eyes right there and simply just gone in and added a little bit more texture and a little bit more clarity. Fantastic tool. And in this last example, I want to show you how I would make an Orton effect in Camera Raw or Lightroom. And it may be a little bit different from how other people do, but let's just select Auto first. And then I go in and I take my linear gradient tool and just select the entire photo. Now here I go in and just choose some negative clarity, maybe a little bit of dehaze. So we add in a little bit of that glow. Do I want to choose the texture? I don't know. But here comes the secret, which is probably different from others. I go in, intersect mask with, choose luminance range, like some other people do. But what I like to do is to bring down the highlights part here. Now, generally, when we make Orton effects, it's about bringing out that glow. But the thing is that glow is glowing from the highlights into the shadows. So if you bring in the shadows like this here, then we are only adding the glow to the highlights. And yeah, the highlights are glowy, fine. But the thing is, we want to make sure that that glow glows into the shadows. And that is why I bring down the highlights part right here. So we have those highlights that are then being blown into the shadows. And you can also see we're having another problem, which is up here. So because we have put in negative clarity, we can still see here, because the blue sky here is still relatively dark, that those shadows are actually glowing into the sky. So if I toggle my mask on and off, you can see we kind of have like a little bit of like a darker area right there. If I go in here and bring the clarity down, you can really see how we create this shadow. So how to get rid of that? We go in, we say subtract, color range, and just choose the blue. And then we can play around and refine it a little bit. So in that way, we make sure that the glow that we actually want, if we put overlay, we can still see where that glow is applied, is mainly in the shadows. And from here, we can still go in and refine it even more. Like if we don't want all the shadows to be hit, then we can go in and do something like this here. So generally, when you make an Orton effect, you want to make sure that your highlights are glowing into the shadows and not the other way around. So if you want to learn even more editing techniques, be sure to enroll in my big Photoshop for landscape photographers post-processing course. There is a $100 discount down in the description of the video. If you see this after the spring sale, you may check it out and see if there's not another discount. And check out the video on the screen right now if you want to learn much more about light in landscape photography. It's really a good video. I think you should watch it.